Almost every enslaved African forced across the Atlantic, 95 out of every 100, never set foot in what became the United States. They were carried somewhere else. And for 2 centuries, the assumption was that their descendants must vastly outnumber the descendants of the small fraction who landed here. But when geneticists ran the DNA of tens of thousands of people across the Americas, the numbers refused to line up. The places that received the most Africans somehow carry less of them today. And the reason why is one of the most disturbing things modern science has uncovered about slavery. In July of 2020, a team led by population geneticist Stephen Micheletti published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics that did something no historian had ever been able to do. They took the genetic data of more than 50,000 people living on both sides of the Atlantic, over half of them with African ancestry, and laid it directly against the shipping records of the slave trade itself. Those records come from the Transatlantic slave trade database, a decades-long project assembled by historians David Eltis and David Richardson, drawing on the logs of nearly 35,000 individual slaving voyages, an archive thought to capture somewhere between 2/3 and 4/5 of every slaving expedition that ever crossed the Atlantic. For the first time, the paper trail of the slave ships and the living biology of their victims' descendants could be compared line by line. The researchers could ask, for a given region of the Americas, which parts of Africa its people's DNA pointed back to, and then check whether the ships had actually run that route. The question was simple. Did the DNA say what the document said? In most ways, it did. The genetic links followed the known voyages with eerie precision. But where the DNA disagreed, it disagreed in ways that exposed something the documents had quietly hidden for 400 years. The ledgers recorded who was loaded onto the ships. They did not record what happened to those people once the ships had gone. The genome did. To understand what they found, you have to start with the scale of where people actually went. Between the early 1500s and the 1860s, roughly 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships. Around 1.5 to 2 million of them died during the crossing itself, the journey called the Middle Passage, their bodies thrown into the same ocean they were being dragged across. About 10.5 million survived to be sold, and the destinations were nothing like what most people picture. Brazil alone took in the largest share, close to 5 million human beings, more than any other place on Earth. The islands of the Caribbean took in a comparable number, feeding the sugar plantations that were making Europe rich beyond imagination. South America and the Caribbean together absorbed the overwhelming majority of every African ever carried across that ocean. The engine driving almost all of it was sugar, a crop so profitable and so deadly to harvest that it functioned in practice as a machine for consuming human lives. North America, the colonies that became the United States, received fewer than 1 in 20. The most cited figure is around 388,000 people who arrived directly, somewhere between 4 and 5% of the entire trade. By volume, the United States was a footnote in the transatlantic slave trade. A bit player, the sugar colonies were the main event, and it was not close. And the people poured out of specific corners of Africa, not the continent as a whole. The trade drew most heavily from the western and west central coasts, the region around the mouth of the Congo and Angola, the stretch the traders called the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra around the Niger Delta, the Gold Coast, and Senegambia in the far west. Each of those regions fed different ships bound for different colonies, which is precisely why the DNA can be matched to the routes at all. A person's ancestry isn't a vague smear across Africa. It points with surprising sharpness back toward the particular coastlines where their ancestors were stolen, the entire reason this study was even possible. So here's the assumption almost everyone makes, and it feels like simple arithmetic. If the Caribbean and Brazil took in more than 9 out of every 10 enslaved Africans, then today, 2 centuries later, the descendants of those people should dominate the genetic map of the Americas. The few who came to North America should be a thin trace by comparison. More arrivals should mean more descendants. That is how populations are supposed to work, It is exactly that assumption the DNA destroys. Here's the first crack in the story. By the year 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, roughly 4 million enslaved people lived in the American South. 4 million, descended from an importation of fewer than 400,000. The population had grown to roughly 10 times the number that had ever arrived. At the time of American independence, there have been around 500,000. In the span of 3 or 4 generations, with the Atlantic trade legally shut off in 1808, that number multiplied into millions from within. And by that same point, something staggering had happened across the whole hemisphere. About 2/3 of all the enslaved people alive in the entire Western world were living in the United States, the one place that had imported the fewest of them. Now look at the other side. Brazil imported more people than anywhere on earth, and yet after its slave trade was choked off, its enslaved population did not grow. It declined. The Caribbean told the same brutal story, island by island. These were the regions that took in almost everyone, and their enslaved populations could not sustain themselves from one generation to the next. They had to be refilled constantly with new ships full of new captives because the people already there were dying faster than children were being born to replace them. That is the paradox at the center of this entire video. The place that received the fewest Africans ended up with the most descendants. The places that received the most ended up needing endless resupply just to hold their numbers steady. The import records and the survival records tell opposite stories, and the DNA sides with survival. To understand why, forget genetics for a second and think about a bank account. Imagine 2 accounts. Into the first, someone deposits a fortune all at once, millions, but the account hemorrhages money every single month, far faster than any interest could ever replace. To keep it from hitting zero, the owner has to keep wiring in more money, year after year, decade after decade, just to maintain the balance. Now picture the second account, a modest opening deposit, a fraction of the first. But this one earns steadily, the balance compounds quietly, and over the decades it grows into something enormous, without another cent ever being added. The first account is the Caribbean and Brazil. The second is the American South. The sugar plantations consumed human lives at a rate that demanded perpetual importation. The deposits were huge, but the losses were just as huge. Men were worked to death in the cane fields and the boiling houses, where exhaustion, brutal heat, and horrific accidents around the open kettles and crushing rollers killed at a staggering pace, and the system simply ordered more people to replace them. On some islands, planners openly calculated that it was cheaper to work a person to death within a handful of years and buy a replacement than to keep that person alive, and they ran their estates accordingly. North America, growing tobacco, rice, and later cotton rather than sugar, was lethal in its own ways, but it did not destroy its enslaved population faster than that population could reproduce. So that population grew on its own. Demographers have a clinical name for the difference. When a population's births outpace its deaths, that is natural increase. When deaths outpace births, that is natural decrease. The enslaved United States is one of the only large slave societies in recorded history to achieve sustained natural increase. The sugar colonies of the Caribbean and Brazil were defined by the opposite. Death rates in the Caribbean ran roughly a third higher than in the South, and in Brazil, the life expectancy of an enslaved person at birth was around 27 years. The 95% did not vanish into thin air. A staggering number of them simply did not survive long enough to leave a single line of descendants behind them. That is the first thing the DNA reveals about where they went. It reveals where they were consumed. But the genetic data goes somewhere even darker than mortality. And this is the part that made the researchers stop. When they compared the African DNA living in the Americas today to who the shipping records said had actually crossed the ocean, they found a violent imbalance written into the genome itself. Far more of the surviving African ancestry traces back to women than to men. And in some regions, the gap was almost incomprehensible. In parts of Central America, the data suggested that enslaved African women contributed something on the order of 13 to 17 times more to the present-day gene pool than enslaved African men did. Think about what that number actually means. The ships did not carry mostly women. They carried more men than women, often around 2 men for every woman. So a gene pool that overwhelmingly descends from the women is not a record of who arrived. It is a record of what was done to them after they arrived. Geneticists can see this with unusual clarity because of 2 special pieces of DNA. One is passed down almost untouched from mother to child, generation after generation, tracing a pure maternal line back through time. The other is carried only by men and passed from father to son, tracing a pure paternal line. Think of them as 2 separate family surnames, one inherited only down the mother's side, one only down the father's. When researchers read the African signatures in those 2 lines and found the maternal African line everywhere and the paternal African line strangely faint, they were reading in biological shorthand a story of which ancestors were allowed to have children and which were not. African men were worked to death in the fields, their lineages cut off before they could ever continue. Enslaved African women were subjected to systematic sexual violence by enslavers, forced to bear children who carried their ancestry forward while the men's ancestry was being systematically erased from existence. Geneticists call this pattern sex-biased admixture. Stripped of the technical language, ch is the genetic fingerprint of rape and of the deliberate destruction of a people's men, preserved silently in the cells of their descendants centuries later. The bias was not identical everywhere. It ran most extreme in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, and was less severe, though still clearly present in the United States. But its very existence tells you that the brutality was not uniform. It was shaped region by exactly how each slave economy chose to use and discard the people it held. The genome recorded those choices. This is the real answer to where the 95% went. They went into a system that didn't just kill them. In many places, it severed their bloodlines so that the size of their presence in the trade was never matched by the size of their presence in the DNA. The documents counted the bodies that arrived. The genome counted the families that were allowed to exist, and those 2 numbers are not the same. Before we go further, I want to be honest with you about what this data can and cannot say, because that honesty is the entire point of this channel. These genetic estimates come from people who chose to take a consumer DNA test, not from a perfect random sample of every person in the Americas. That introduces real limits, and the researchers themselves are careful to spell them out. The percentages are estimates, not a census, and a sample of volunteers can lean in directions a true cross-section would not. And when historians say survival in North America was less lethal, they mean less lethal in comparison to the meat grinder of the Sugar Islands. Not gentle, not survivable in any humane sense. The earliest arrivals to the rice coast of the Carolinas died at rates that rivaled the worst of the Caribbean. Less deadly than the deadliest place on earth is not the same thing as safe. There is also a fascinating wrinkle that proves the data is telling the truth rather than flattering anyone. The DNA showed far more Nigerian ancestry in the United States than the direct shipping records could explain. Very few ships sailed straight from that region to North American ports. The answer turned out to be the intra-American trade. People were landed first in the British Caribbean, then shipped onward into the United States, a second forced migration stacked on top of the first. Meanwhile, ancestry from the Senegambia region showed up far less than the records predicted because so many of those captives were funneled to the deadliest rice plantations, where they died before they could leave descendants. The DNA didn't just confirm the history. In places, it quietly corrected it. And one thing this is not: a contest over whose slavery was worst. Every version of it was a catastrophe, and the people caught in each were individuals, not statistics in a regional comparison. The point of laying the numbers side by side isn't to rank suffering. It's that the differences between regions are exactly what let the genome testify at all. If every place had been identical, the DNA would have nothing surprising to say. It is the contrast that makes the hidden machinery visible, and the machinery is what we are trying to see. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this channel exists, to follow the evidence into the places the textbooks rounded off and left blank. If that's the kind of history you want more of, take 1 second to subscribe. It decides whether work like this keeps reaching people. Then stay with me, because the last piece reframes everything you've heard so far. Because here's the thing about that small 4 or 5% who landed in North America. They were not spared. They were not lucky. They endured a system built to own them, sell their children at auction, and break their families apart on a slaveholder's whim. And they survived it in such numbers that their descendants became one of the largest African-descended population on the entire planet, built almost entirely from the people already here rather than from new ships. And there is a bitter edge to even that survival. The very growth that let the enslaved population multiply also fed a vast domestic slave trade inside the United States, in which roughly 1 million people were torn from their families and marched south and west to the cotton frontier, a forced migration so large it has its own name, the Second Middle Passage. Endurance and atrocity were braided together, but the result is undeniable in the genome. Every African American alive today is, in a real and measurable sense, the genetic proof of an endurance the system was specifically designed to prevent. The DNA of Black America is not a record of how many arrived. It is a record of how many refused to be erased. And that refusal was not passive. It happened in marriages the law refused to recognize, in families that reassembled themselves after every sale, in children raised by whole communities when parents were taken. The genome can only fill with the children of people who managed, against everything stacked against them, to form bonds and keep them. So when the data shows the descendants of a few 100,000 swelling into millions, it is quietly recording acts of will, the decision, made over and over in the worst conditions imaginable, to love and to continue. That is not a small thing the science stumbled onto. It is the heart of the entire finding. And the 95%, the millions carried to Brazil and the Caribbean, their thinner presence in the modern genome is not their failure. It is the clearest evidence we have of how completely they were destroyed. The absence in the data is itself the testimony. A people can be written out of a bloodline and still leave a mark precisely in the place where the mark should have been and isn't. When geneticists went looking for the descendants the import numbers had promised them and found only a fraction, that gap was the crime, made visible at the level of the cell. So when someone asks where the other 95% went, the honest answer is the hardest one. A great many of them went on to build the populations of Brazil, Colombia, Jamaica, Haiti, and a dozen other nations whose music, language, religion, and food are simply unthinkable without them. Their descendants are alive and thriving and counted in the tens of millions, and a vast number of them went nowhere at all because they were never permitted to become anyone's ancestor. The DNA reveals where they went by also revealing where they stopped. The science here doesn't sensationalize that history. It does something much heavier. It takes a number that sounds like a dry accounting detail, 5%, 95%, and shows you that the percentages were never really about geography at all. They were about who was permitted to have a future. The shipping ledgers recorded a business transaction. The genome recorded its true costs, carried forward in living people who never agreed to keep the receipt. That is what makes this kind of evidence so hard to argue with. You can dispute an old document, question who wrote it and why. But the genome was written by no one. It kept no agenda. It simply recorded what happened to the bodies the ledger stopped following. And then it carried that record silently for 10 generations until someone finally knew how to read it. The 5 and the 95 were the difference between the families that were allowed to grow and the ones that were stopped. If this changed how you see those numbers, the next video goes straight at the strangest gap in all of it, the one African region that the shipping records say should be everywhere in American DNA and yet has almost completely vanished from it. What happened to those people is its own buried story, and the genetics are only beginning to tell it. I'll see you there.